Hey, welcome everybody. Nachavach in Africa. We're another week in Africa. We've always connected to the reading of the Torah, whether we're in shul or not. Please God, we'll be back in shul soon. But we're always able to take messages that the Torah is teaching us this week, and hopefully we'll find some relevance to our own situation as well. So, starting with a summary, as we always do, we got a double-header this week, Matot and Masei. That brings us to the end of the book of Numbers. This Shabbat we would have said Chazak, Chazak, which is the completion of the entire book of the Torah. And next week, always the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, we have the portion of Devarim and the Shabbat Chazan, which we'll deal with next week. What does it deal with as we start the reading this week? A person's vow has to be fulfilled. So a very intense, detailed section that talks about what happens if a person made a vow and wants to annul the vow, and who can annul the vow and in what circumstance. Very specific, and it therefore just sheds light on the importance of keeping a vow, of how important it is to fulfill whatever comes out of our mouth. It should be holy. It should never ever be something that we just say, well, I said, so I said. What comes out of our mouth is, in Yiddish they said, gesagt ist getan. What you say is as good as done. That's how important it is. We'll come back to that subject. There's then the instruction, which we had a bit last week, but now it actually happens. It's the very last detail and performance of duty that Moshe Rabbeinu, as a leader of the Jewish people, does, and that is to battle and take vengeance against the Midyanites, Midyan. 12,000 strong army is led by Pinchas, and they win this war very significantly. All the adult Midianites males and Balaam and Midyan's 5 kings, all of them who had plotted against the Jewish people, were killed. Then the Jewish people kept the woman alive. They were actually the culprits, because we remember that Midyan was the nation that once they could not curse the Jewish people, they went back to the old proven record and method, which was to entice the Jewish people, and the woman tried to draw the Jewish boys to idolatry. So the women were actually the culprits in the whole moral war against the Jewish people. And they spared the women, the children, and the battle spoils. And Moshe was angry. And the bottom line was that women who was of an age that could have seduced the men were also killed. But young girls were not. Now, coming from this battle against Midyan, there were a whole lot of vessels that were captured. And for the first time in the Torah, we're given the instruction of how to use vessels that come from a source that is not Jewish, and therefore was used for products and ingredients that are not kosher. How do you then use these vessels for kosher? So all of the laws that relate to koshering, and the bottom line is that whatever the degree of heat is in the usage of that vessel in the first place, with a non-kosher, for example, meat, that is the degree that one has to use to kosher that vessel. So, for example, if it's a spit that was used for non-kosher meat on a braai, the only way that that spit and braai can be koshered is by replicating the same heat that it was used at, which means it has to be an open, raging fire. It has to be a glowing hot fire. You always use the same heat to kasher as you used for using the item in the first place. If you only used it as a pot to boil soup in, then you only need to boil water in the pot so that it overflows the pot, and that is good enough to kasher it. If it was only used with light heat, then you can use a blowtorch with very light heat, which is called libun kal. So, and if it was something that wasn't in fact an issue of kashrut at all, but the transference from a non-Jew's property to a Jew's property, then it has to be dipped in a mikveh. And all of these rules are learned specifically from this battle against Midyan and the vessels that were captured. And we'll come back to why. Why are the laws of kashrut and relating to expunging the absorbed negative material from the walls of the vessel, why is it specifically in this battle against Midyan, this last battle of Moshe Rabbeinu? Then it tells us that the soldiers had to purify themselves because they came into contact with the corpses in battle. As I said, the laws of kosher, food utensils that were amongst the spoils. The spoils were divided evenly between the soldiers and the community. It's interesting insight. You could think that the soldiers have risked their lives more, and therefore they were entitled to more. It gives a sense of community, that everyone plays their role. Soldiers play their role, and people on the second tier of defense also play a role. And remembering in the 60s, when so many South Africans went to volunteer in Israel, and many of them landed up picking carrots or tomatoes on the kibbutzim up north, and it was not that they put on uniforms and they went into the Air Force or into tanks, but they played a huge role because they freed up the whole of society that went to war and allowed Israel to continue working. So we actually rely on every element of society, and here we see an example where the spoils of war were spread evenly between the soldiers and the civilian force of the Jewish people. Then it speaks about tithes that were given to the Kohanim, to the Levim, and it was an interesting battle because not one person was lost in this battle, not one. Previously, this Midyanite nation caused a plague of 24,000 Jews dying. This time, 12,000, half the amount that died, took on the whole of Midyan, and not one person died. It only goes to reinforce the fact that the wars that the Jewish people fought were with Hashem and for Hashem, and therefore the whole vulnerability and the whole loss that took place or didn't take place was in the hands of Hashem. In gratitude, the Jewish people took all the gold jewelry and that was plundered, they gave it to the Mishkan. They didn't take it for their own personal bank account. Full stop. Now comes a whole new episode, and one that we said we would deal with this week, and that is the East Bank. Everyone knows about the West Bank. There is no such reference to the West Bank in our Jewish sources. The West Bank is in fact Judea and Samaria, a part of Israel, never the West Bank. What we do know is about the East Bank. On the other side of the Jordan, which is now Jordan, that's where 2.5 tribes, Reuben and Gad, and half of Manasseh requested that they be able to settle on the other side, not in the boundaries of Israel as we understood them to be, but on the East Bank, outside of the boundaries, which would be present-day Jordan. Moshe Rabbeinu got very angry. We'll come back to this point, and he said, are you following in the footsteps of the spies? As we were going to go into the land 40 years ago, the spies came back with a negative report. They said that we're not going to go into the land, and they caused devastation, the whole generation to die out in the desert, 40 years in the desert. Now we're coming back to the point that we're about to enter into the land, and we've got a new voice that is speaking from the Jewish people that we're actually not so keen on this land, we're ready to stay outside of the land. Is this a replica, a repetition of what happened 40 years ago when the spies came back from the land? And Reuben and Gad, and they responded, and they said, no, definitely not. We do not want to undermine. We're not opting out of the conquest. We will lead the conquest. And they carried on to say that we will build for our cattle and our families. We'll come back to this point, pens, and we will set up our families on the eastern bank of the Jordan, and then we will leave them there and lead, be the pioneers, be the front runners of the war effort against the 7 nations that inhabited the land of Canaan. And only after we've conquered the entire land will we go back to our families. This is not opting out. We are ready to lead the Jewish people in battle. We'll come back to this whole discussion of the 2.5 tribes and their apportionment of land now outside of the land of Israel, which became part of the land of Israel. We then commanded that Canaan and all the idols had to be destroyed. The borders of the land are delineated, and the division of the land of Israel as originally intended was now only divided amongst 9.5 tribes. Everyone got a much bigger section because 2.5 tribes were now going to inherit the land on the eastern bank, which meant that the land as it was intended would now not be divided by 12 but by 9.5 tribes. Each tribe's portion of land is divided between the tribal members. There was a person given the responsibility of dividing that land to his own tribe. Each tribe set a representative who then apportioned the sub-portions of that tribal land to each of the members of the tribe. Full stop. New subject is that we are instructed that there has to be 42 plus 6 cities for the Leviim. The Leviim did not get a portion in the land. The whole tribe of Levi was not apportioned a piece of land in the promised land. In fact, Hashem hiu nachal aschem, God was their apportionment. They received gifts from all of the Jewish people, but they did have cities in which they lived. And there was a whole lot of cities, 42 of them, plus 6. The plus 6 were cities of refuge that were to offer refuge to anyone who inadvertently kills another. A guy is hoeing his field, the blade of his hoe flies off the handle, kills another human being. He did not intend to do it. It was a complete mistake, but there's a concern that the family might want to avenge the blood of their deceased relative, and therefore cities of refuge were set up. We'll hopefully come back to that as well. They had to be very clearly signposted, that a person would not have to stop on the road and say, excuse me, how do I get to the city of refuge? This is the days before Waze and Google Maps. So they might have to stop and ask somebody at the gas station, and the person would say, oh yeah, you're looking for a city of refuge. What did you do wrong? So no, so you had to avoid any person who knew how to get there without any questions. That had to be signposted, the roads had to be perfect, and there were many other details that related to the person who had to go to the city of refuge. How long did they remain there? They remained there until the death of the Kohen Gadol. Hopefully there'll be time to discuss why that is the issue, that they remained there until the Kohen Gadol of that generation passes away. It could be in a year's time, and it could be in 50 or 60 or 70 years' time. It was hinged and dependent on the lifespan of the Kohen Gadol. Why did the person, the inadvertent killer, remain in the city where he was defended, in the city of refuge, as long as the Kohen Gadol of that generation was alive? Finally, the last point in the book of Numbers is that the daughters of Tzlafchad, remember they were there last week asking Moshe Rabbeinu, we don't have brothers, and our father's portion is now going to be lost. It's going to go somewhere else, and we want to have an inheritance. And God told Moshe Rabbeinu that these 5 daughters of Tzlafchad, in fact, deserved to get an inheritance. But now they were told not to marry out of the tribe, that when they came to Shidduchim and they were looking for husbands, they should take husbands specifically from their own tribe, so that the land that was apportioned to them from their tribe would not go over to another tribe through marriage. If they married out of the tribe, then the husband would inherit that portion of land to his son, which would be from a different tribe. So they were told that because they were now entitled to inherit from their own tribe, they should not marry out of the tribe, so that the land apportioned to their tribe would not land up leaving their tribe. That's basically the summary of all the events that take place. Quite an action-packed portion. Let's just go back to the very first detail that we said was, according to all that proceeds out of his mouth, so shall he do. There's like a very general statement about how careful we have to be with the words that we utter and how holy they have to be in our commitment to fulfill them. As the book of Koheles says, Ecclesiastes, better that you should not vow than you should vow and not fulfill. Don't be hasty to say words and then not be able to fulfill those words. Rather go slow. Rather don't make the commitment than to make a commitment and not then fulfill it. We've had situations where people have stood in front of the Torah even and have made commitments of charity to give to the shul or whatever charity, and then they might as well have made a commitment for another 10 million, because either way the shul wasn't going to get any richer. They didn't intend to pay. Once they weren't intending to pay, they might as well promised much, much more. But that's very serious and very sad. What comes out of our mouths we have to honor. And that's why on Yom Kippur, look how serious it is. Before Rosh Hashanah, we have Hatarat Nedarim. We annul the vows, just in case. Obviously, that's not a vow that relates to another human being where you promise to give another person 100 rand and then you annul your vow. You cannot annul such a vow. It relates to religious vows. I'm committing myself to have this religious added commitment to Hashem. I will eat, I won't eat these products because of more strict adherence to kashrut. So it relates to additional stringencies in the fulfillment of mitzvot. And those vows are very, very important. That's why we annul them before Rosh Hashanah. And just in case, we have Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre, again, does not mean that a guy goes into Kol Nidre and says, all the vows that I took, please let them be as null and void. And that would apply to a person's commitment to another human being of paying their money or giving them a gift. You cannot annul those vows on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, we are annulling the vows that I might have inadvertently made. And I said, I will come to shul every single day, and then I didn't. And now I'm being held responsible and accountable to my word that I gave to Hashem. And that's why we so carefully go into Yom Kippur saying, do I stand clean with my words? Words matter. Words can build. Words were used to create the world, and words could be used to destroy the world. And words could be used to lift one another, and words could be used to undermine. So our words are very, very important. So we have a whole section over here. What happens if a person did make a vow that I'm going to fulfill the following detail or mitzvah, and then cannot? Under certain circumstances, they would go to the expert in this field, the rabbi who is specifically expert in this field, and say, would ask him or her, did you have in mind when you made the vow, were you aware of the consequences? Did you think through how it would affect your life and the lives of everyone around you? And there are circumstances where they could annul the vow, but it was very serious and had to be done in a very serious way. So it only tells us how important it is to fulfill the words of our lips. Do not say something and not mean it. Whereas my teacher that I always quote, Josh Gordon from California, Olav Shalom, he was a very big influence in my life. He always used to say, there's certain people who say, I didn't say it, and if I said it, I didn't mean it, and if I meant it, I changed my mind. Go have to dealings with such a person. You don't know what's going to happen next. When you say, you fulfill. That is the way you have to live your life. It's holy. I want to just go through quite a complicated thing, which is a Hasidic discourse relating to the nation of Midyan. We know that the nation of Midyan represented the immorality that deviated the Jewish people from Hashem, took them away from Hashem, that destroyed their moral compass, and in the end undermined us when we stood so invincible and Hashem protected us from all the curses. We brought about the curse on ourselves by acting in an immoral way through the daughters of Midyan. But there is something very, very important about this battle and the way it's presented. The battle against Midyan is said, Moshe Rabbeinu, go out and fight Midyan, and after that you will be gathered unto your people, meaning that you'll pass away. It's not just the last thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did. Hashem hinges and ties the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, meaning the fulfillment of his life's mission, happens with the destruction of Midyan. It seems to be an important part of completing Moshe Rabbeinu's mission on this world. There are so many details that relate to this nation of Midyan that makes us want to understand on a deeper level what Midyan represents. And the commentaries explain that the word Midyan comes from the word Madon umeriva, which means strife, argument, fighting, lack of harmony. Midyan is the essence of divisiveness and therefore the source of all evil, as we will explain. Groundless hatred, which means sinas chinam, when there is hatred between people that doesn't even have a basis. It is a character trait that looks for the problem, that looks to create strife. It's not looking to find a solution, it's always looking to create strife. That is what Midyan represents. And where does that come from? That comes from an ego that is overinflated and views the very existence of others as an encroachment upon myself. A person who has such an inflated ego that walks around constantly feeling that people are doing me in, because everybody is challenging my being or my strengths or my accomplishments. The person is always looking for arguments because his ego does not allow him to embrace anyone. And this is actually the antithesis of what spirituality and holiness is about. Because holiness is about Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Everything in this world is one with God. And therefore there is an ability to thread together where everything needs to have its place in the fulfillment of God's world. We're not looking for strife, we're looking for harmony. We're trying to join together all the things that are part of Hashem's great world. So we have this war, the spiritual war, between an approach that could be going on inside of ourselves, an inner battle, where our own ego is overextending itself to constantly look for arguments and fights. And there are such people that whatever it is, it's a fight, it's an argument, because everything gets on their nerves, because their ego is too big. Somebody once came to the Rebbe and said, I can't take it, everyone's stepping all over me. And the Rebbe said to him, maybe the problem is that you're spreading yourself all over. That's how they're stepping on you. Wherever they walk, they're stepping on you. Because your ego is so overinflated that you've spread yourself over everything. So now everyone who walks is walking on you. Take up less space and people won't walk on you so to the same degree. So this battle between ego, which then results in a disharmonious world, a world that is fragmented and disparate and apart, is at war with the real view. The real view is to see how this world is part of Hashem. I'm part of Hashem. We're all part of Hashem. And therefore we embrace one another as brothers and sisters because we're all part of Hashem. That's the war. And all evil derives from divisiveness, the distortion of Hashem's oneness. That's the inner battle that we're referring to with Midyan. Not only a biblical battle that Moshe Rabbeinu had to wage before he passed on from this world thousands of years ago, but an inner battle that each and every one of us have to contend with. Our own ego, which looks to find battles with everything around us, doesn't want to get on because everything gets on our nerves and everything gets under our skin. And a person who lets go and says, I'm here as part of a bigger mission, how do we work this out together? Now, before the Jewish people could conquer the 7 nations, that was the 7 nations that inhabited the land of Canaan, specifically 7. Remember, 7 represents the emotional qualities inside of ourselves. That's what we try and hone in the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot. Each week, we address a different element, emotional trait that is inside of ourselves. The 7 nations of Canaan represented the 7 negative traits that are inside each and every one of us. We're taking this beyond the obvious meaning of the verse, and we're saying that actually this battle with Midyan happens in our lives. We all have to take the land of Canaan. We all have to get to the promised land. And in order to do that, we need to conquer the 7 nations, meaning the 7 negative traits that are inside of ourselves. We have to master ourselves in all of the different emotional tendencies that make up our being. And they represent the 7 negative traits of the heart. But in order to do that, before you could take on the land of Canaan, before you could take on the 7 nations, you have to master something before that. You have to destroy Midyan, which is the source and cause of all negativity. And that is the battle against ego, the battle against inflated sense of self, which therefore is constantly in a situation of strife and war with the whole world around us, because everything seems to be getting in my way. And who is the person who can master this initial battle, before the battle against the 7 negative traits, before the battle against the 7 nations that are in the land of Canaan? Who can master the battle against Midyan, against ego? Of course, it's only Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu, who was Va'ish Moshe Anav Mikol Adam Asher Pnei Adam, Moshe Rabbeinu was the most humble of any human being who ever lived on this world. He was the utter embodiment of the trait of self-abnegation. And only Moshe Rabbeinu could therefore have the ingredients to destroy Midyan. And therefore Hashem said, Moshe Rabbeinu, you fulfill this mission of destroying Midyan, and then you will be gathered unto your people because you will have fulfilled the ultimate mission of your life. And if you can hand that ability over to the Jewish people in their connection to Moshe Rabbeinu, then they too will be able to win the battle against Midyan, which is our inner battle against ego. And once we master ourselves and ourself and its negative tendencies of being overinflated, we then have a capacity to look more specifically at the 7 emotional weaknesses, the negative traits of our being, and to deal with each one of them, all the negative senses of ourselves, which we do, but specifically between Pesach and Shavuot, but we do in a sense every single day. And obviously we don't only have 7 negative traits, we have positive traits that are parallel to them, and we try and bring ourselves into the domain of each of the 7 characteristics in the most positive way. I'm just giving you an example. This is a mimer that is many pages long of how the Hasidic teaching always tries to take the obvious teaching of the pasuk, which is talking about Moshe Rabbeinu biblically fighting Midyan, but there is a deeper understanding of the verses which do not replace the simple meaning. But in addition to it, this is a battle that we can relate to in our own lives. We all have inner demons, and we all have inner battles that we have to fight. And Moshe Rabbeinu, and being connected to Moshe Rabbeinu, gives us the ability to fight off Midyan, this catalyst for negativity, for strife, for undermining the unity of Hashem in the world, which comes from arrogance. And by overwhelming the arrogance, we can then deal with the details of the 7 nations, which is the 7 characteristics that are deep inside of ourselves. Okay, maybe a little bit deep, but certainly part of our learning of this Shabbat. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, arm yourselves and take vengeance on Midyan. So here, it's interesting that we have a seeming contradiction in the wording of who is vengeance being taken on behalf of. God said to Moshe, avenge the vengeance of the Jewish people. Take vengeance for the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he speaks to the Jewish people, he says, take vengeance for God, God's vengeance. So who was it? Was it vengeance on behalf of the Jewish people, or was it vengeance on behalf of God? So the masters, Hasidic masters, explain, well, both of them in a good relationship, this is how it works. God sees the war of Midyan, avenging what they have done so detrimentally to the Jewish people. God is concerned of the well-being of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people, they are concerned about God's purpose being achieved and being fulfilled in this world. That's a good relationship. When a husband is worried about his wife, and the wife is worried about her husband, and the needs of the husband is uppermost in the wife, and the needs of the wife is uppermost in the mind of the husband, you have a good relationship. If the husband keeps saying to his wife, this is what I need, and this is what you have to fulfill for me, it's about me, and she's saying it's about me, that's the ingredients for not such a good relationship. A real good relationship is when each side, Moshe Rabbeinu is worried about God's cause in the world, and God is worried about the Jewish people's cause in the world. And then there's a good relationship between God and the Jewish people. In all our relationships, we should be putting ourselves second to the people we love. And ultimately, that gives for a good recipe for happy living in this world. We're too much into our own selves, and then sometimes to our own detriment. Now let's just deal with this very central core piece of the 2.5 tribes. So I've already given a little bit of insight that Moshe Rabbeinu was angry at them because they said, we don't want to go into the land. Moshe Rabbeinu really gives them a misha veirach. He gives them over their heads, and he says, you don't want to go into the land? This is echoes of what happened 40 years ago when the spies didn't want to go into the land. Don't you remember what happened? That whole generation died out in the desert. 40 years later, we finally resolved all of the problems. We're going to go into the promised land. Now you're starting up, you're triggering the same raw nerve. You don't want to go into the land of Israel. And then they come back and they said, no. Moshe Rabbeinu, not only is that not what we are aligning ourselves to, the negative arguments of the spies 40 years ago, we are actually intending to expand the land of Israel. We're not looking to opt out and say we don't have to go into the land. We want to expand and extend the land. Yes, our motivation is that we've been looking for pasture and what is good for our sheep, and the East Bank has particularly good land to feed our sheep. Yeah, that was the motivation. But this is not coming out of cowardice, not coming out of a sense that we don't have the ability, and we will prove it. We will go in front of the Jewish people in fighting for the land of Israel, and only after all the battles have been won, that's when we're going to go back to our wives and to our families, and we're going to then take residence on the east bank of the Jordan, which will now be an extension of the land of Israel. So what it comes to tell us is that sometimes things look similar. The motivations could be suspect of being very, very similar, but what headspace are we in? Are we seeing ourselves as grasshoppers and opting out? Or are we in a headspace of absolutely wanting to dedicate ourselves and commit ourselves to the mission? And the end result is that deprived the Jewish people of the land of Israel for 40 years. And this 2.5 tribes of Israel, they resulted in the land of Israel being extended even beyond its borders. And it's a question of where your head is, where our heads are. Sometimes the argument looks like it's the same, and a positive and a negative. But the question is, where is our heart? Are we ready to give our life for the values that we live for? Or are we looking to opt out and to say we're lazy or tired or scared, or we don't believe that we can do it? And these 2.5 tribes clearly demonstrated their readiness to be in front of the Jewish people in the battle. They were not looking to opt out at all. Now, what's interesting from this whole section in the Torah, we actually learn a lot of things. One of the things we learn is that when you make a t'nai, when you make a condition, you need to say both sides of the condition. If we go in front and we lead the Jewish people in battle, then we'll get the land on the other side, the east bank of the Jordan. And if we don't lead the Jewish people in battle, we will not get that land. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu presented it to them. And from here, the Talmud learns out that in general, whenever you make a conditional sale or a condition, and you're saying, if this happens, then that will be the result, spell it out both ways. Not only the optimistic side, if this goes well, then this will be the result. Put into the smaller detail, what happens if it doesn't go well, then this is the result, the opposite result. Spell it out both ways. It's called a t'nai koful, a condition that is doubled over. It's the statement of the condition and the corollary of that condition. Both of them are stated, so there is no possibility of mistake. It doesn't lead to any vague interpretation. Everyone knows clearly what is being said. Now, in addition to that, let me just see if I have another slide in this regard. In addition to that, the language that is used by the 2.5 tribes to Moshe Rabbeinu and Moshe Rabbeinu's language back is almost identical. But if you've got a good eye, you'll see in the conversation, they come to Moshe Rabbeinu, they make a proposal. Moshe Rabbeinu seems to repeat their proposal exactly. And he says, and if you will do as I say, then yes, then you can keep the east side of the Jordan, the east bank. But it looks as though Moshe Rabbeinu is simply repeating what they said. They said, if we go ahead, then we'll get it. And if we don't get ahead, we won't get it. And Moshe Rabbeinu then repeats exactly what they said, seemingly exactly the same. And it seems like a waste of words because Moshe Rabbeinu could have just said, yes, exactly as you say. If you do, then yes. But Moshe Rabbeinu repeats it. But if we look closer, and that's the detail that always carries so many messages, we look a little closer at Moshe Rabbeinu's repetition. Yeah, I haven't put it on yet because the next slide is actually the next thing. Thank you, Abby. So it appears as repetition and it's not. Why? When they came to Moshe Rabbeinu, this is what they said. Gidroist soin, we're going to set up pens for our cattle and homes for our wives and children. We will then go and do battle and then we'll come back. And when when Moshe Rabbeinu repeats to them what is acceptable, there is one reversal. Moshe Rabbeinu says, build homes for your wives and children, and also pens for your cattle. And the commentaries, Rashi points out that it looks like a subtlety, it's just a change of order. But Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, be careful. Don't first build pens for your cattle and then homes for your children. Make sure that you first build homes for your children and then pens for your cattle. That is the significant difference between how they worded it to Moshe Rabbeinu and how Moshe Rabbeinu seemingly words it back to them. It's a question of priority, and it can be a very significant difference. in what comes first. Are you building pens for your animal, or are you building homes for your children? I often mention that at the Midyan haben ceremony that happens when a little boy first born, natural birth, of a non-Kohen and Levi is born into the world. 30 days later, we have to have a Midyan haben where we have a ceremony with a Kohen, and we have to redeem the firstborn, because initially the firstborn was dedicated to Hashem. What is the wording of that firstborn Midyan Bechor ceremony? The Kohen says to the father, money or the box? Do you want, that's dating ourselves, eh? That's back to the 60s. Do you want the child, or do you want these 5 gold coins? And he actually says it. Please tell me, Father, which of these 2 do you want? Do you want your son, or do you want the 5 coins? And then the father says very clearly, reading out of the Seder, I want my son, rather than the 5 gold coins. And yes, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Thank God this father's got his head screwed on right. He didn't take the money, he took his children. Brilliant! The father did well. And everyone's happy ever after. So the question has been asked to me is, why do we do this whole charade? This seems like a good act, but why do we need it? Which father is ever going to say, I want the money, I don't want my child? So why do we put the father through saying those words, I rather have my child than the finance? Why do we put the father through it? So I often have explained to fathers who've asked me this question that sometimes what is very obvious in the moment becomes less obvious in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time. In the moment when your child is born, which father is going to say, there's something more important than my child? My financial well-being, my business, my work, my assets are more important than my child. Nobody's ever going to say that. But why are there so many teenage children who are looking for time with their parents? And the parents have no time for their kids because they're busy with the next meeting and they're running to the next important event that is taking place at the business. And the child is looking and saying, parents, did you forget that you chose me when I was born? How could you forget? And we do that. We become distracted, we become involved, and we become so involved with the priority of making a living and career and making sure that we are able to pursue our goals in our lives, that sometimes we put the interests of our children second. They should be the ones we're putting to sleep every night and reading them the Shema and having time to be able to hear what's on their heads and what difficulties they had during the course of a day. If parents don't have the time to be in touch with their children and hear what is going on in their life, and they're not aligned with what's happening in their life, God forbid kids become completely distant and alienated from parents. And then parents, once again, 15 years later, 18 years later, after they said those words, I want my child, not the money is less important, it's about my child, suddenly remember, hey, that's the pledge that I made. How could I put so many things before the interests of my children? And generally, Jewish parents are involved and care and are very good at meeting the needs of their children, generally. But often we don't realize that we get distracted and we say, I don't have time. We say those words. And the child is looking for the opportunity of having the discussion that might share what's going on in their heart, and we miss the opportunity because we're just too busy. We're too rushing. We come in for the second, we don't have time. Anyway, that's the point that is also discussed as the difference between the way the 2.5 tribes said it to Moshe. Moshe came back to them and says, don't tell me first pens for your cattle and then homes for your families. First homes for your families and then pens for your cattle. And that's loaded with a message for all of us. Okay, a very quick point that he said, you shall be guiltless towards Hashem and towards Israel. In this whole process, it says, be careful and make sure that you are kosher to God and kosher to Bnei Israel, that you fulfill your commitment. This was, in a sense, their word that we started the whole portion about, that they would battle first and only then they would take their land. The Chachamim taught from here that a person should always appoint 2 people as trustees over public funds. This concept are guiltless towards God and towards Israel. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, who enjoyed the full trust of Hashem, as it's written, in all my house he is trusted. Hashem said Moshe Rabbeinu was trusted, but nevertheless, when he figured the accounts of the sanctuary, he did it together with others. Because it says, by the hand of Itamar and the son of Aaron. So the Gemara learns on the side over here that we should always be clean before God and before people, which means that God sometimes knows that we're honest, but we shouldn't appear to be less than honest in the minds of people around us. And that's why we need to ensure that we have public funds in the hands of not just one person, but more than one person, so that we can ensure the integrity of what we're doing. Okay, this is the slide that Evia should have had before. They, on the other hand, said we'll build sheepfolds here for your sheep and cities for your young. We've already done that. I want to just, before going on to the journeys, I want to just speak again about why it is that the battle against Midyan is the battle that talks about koshering our vessels. And taking it again on a deeper level, what it means is that sometimes what is absorbed into the walls of the vessels needs to be purged and taken out. And that sometimes presents a greater problem than the actual meat that was in the vessel, because that you can throw out easily. But now you have to take out what was absorbed. And this whole battle against Midyan, which we've described, was one of strife and arrogance. And previously we said about immorality. The issue of Midyan is that it gets under our skin. We absorb it into the way we think and into the way we feel and into the way we conduct our lives. The additions, when we come into contact with negativity on the outside, we can shake it off easily. But when we absorb it into our own thinking, when we become a composite of the thoughts and the feelings of Midyan, then we have to purge it out. That's why the kashering comes from this whole story, to teach us that sometimes we have to expunge the negativity from within, because it's been absorbed. It's not just a matter of shaking it off. We've got to be able to extract it from how it has been absorbed into our thinking. That's a much bigger battle, much more complicated procedure, and that's why this procedure is taught specifically in this context of the war against Midyan. Then the final thing that we talk about is that the second portion of the two portions read this week, Matot and then Masei, it says these are the journeys of the Jewish people. We know that there were 42 journeys. We count them, they're actually listed. 42 journeys from Egypt. And obviously the question is that there is not 42 journeys from Egypt. There was only one journey from Egypt. It was from Sukkot, from Ramses to Sukkot. It was one journey across the border, and at some point you cross the border and then you're out of Egypt. So why does it say 42 journeys out of Egypt? We left Egypt on journey number one. The other 41 were post-Egypt. And the Baal Shem Tov explained that we all have journeys that we have to travel in our lives to reach the promised land. And there's an Egypt. That is the negativity of a land that imprisons us, that holds us back, that wants us to be slaves. Slaves to our negative tendencies, slaves to our Yetzer Hara, to our animals' instincts. Egypt is the constraints and the limitations that don't let a soul achieve its goal. And every moment of our life is part of a journey. And what was Egypt yesterday and what was freedom yesterday, the freedom of yesterday becomes tomorrow's Egypt. Because that journey has another journey beyond it. We've not arrived. So yes, the growth that took place took me from Ramses to Sukkot, and therefore I'm now out of yesterday's Egypt. But today I have a new battle, a new responsibility. I have to emerge from my new limitations. What was maturity yesterday might be the opposite of maturity tomorrow. I need a new horizon. I need to look for greater heights. And that's why there was so many journeys, and all of them were seen to be coming out of Egypt, because what it's teaching us is that we always have a restriction that we need to escape from. And even though we seem to have managed yesterday's battle, if there's a new day, then it affords us the opportunity of a new horizon and a new achievement. And we shouldn't limit our horizons by living outside of yesterday's Egypt. We have to extend ourselves beyond today's Egypt, and then tomorrow's Egypt. Today more than yesterday, and not nearly as much as tomorrow. And the final point relating to these journeys is that see that it's time, that it repeats each of the 42 journeys. It says that they left such and such a place and they arrived in that place. And then it says again, they left that place and they arrived at the next place. So each place is actually mentioned twice. Once as an arrival and once as a departure, which could have been shortened by just saying that we went through the following 42 places. Why does it say they left from Johannesburg and they came to Pretoria, and then they left Pretoria and they came to Warm Baths, or to Bella Bella, and then they left from Bella Bella and they arrived in Petersburg? Why did it say each of the places twice? So one of the commentaries says, because when we go through a place in life, the way we arrive in it and the way we leave that place should be a different place. The place should be different by virtue of us having been through it. Every opportunity that we have in life affords us the opportunity of not only changing ourselves, but impacting on the environment and the place that we're in. When we arrived there, it was one place. When we left it differently, because we have been there and we impacted on that place. And it's not just talking about geographic places. It means every situation in life is an opportunity to reach it, and then to affect it, and then to depart from it. And the way we went into that scenario is different. That scenario is now different when we leave it because of the impact that we had on it. And there are a number of other things that relate to journeys, but we have reached the destination of 8 o'clock. So we're going to stop over here. I thank everybody for joining. Thank you for being here. And I will post it on YouTube as I always do. Have a brilliant week, everybody. And let's keep journeying forward. Journeys after journey after journeys.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Have a good show.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, love.
Thank you.
Thank
See you in the morning. Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.